The wind howled across the barren wasteland of Zorth 9, carrying with it the foul stench of decay. Captain Eric Vance moved silently through the jagged rocks, his eyes scanning the endless horizon for movement. His worn-out tactical visor flickered with warnings, hostile life forms detected, but distant enough for now. He had learned long ago that in places like this, it wasn't the distant threats you worried about, it was the ones lying in wait. The planet was a graveyard of forgotten ships, derelict ruins, and the bones of those who had dared to survive its desolation. Eric wasn't here by choice, but a man like him didn't have many options left. Mercenary work paid well enough. But every mission seemed to drag him deeper into the forgotten corners of the galaxy. He was just about to call it a day when he spotted it, a flicker of light, almost imperceptible, hidden within the crevice of a nearby cliff. Narrowing his eyes, he cautiously approached, hand hovering over the blaster at his side. His boots crunched softly on the dusty ground as he crept forward, then he saw her, a figure, small and fragile, huddled against the rocks. Her skin, pale blue with a faint, iridescent glow, marked her as one of the Serani, an ancient, peaceful race known for their wisdom, not for their ability to survive hell's capes like this. She was barely conscious, her breaths shallow and rapid. Eyes fluttering open at the sound of his approach, Eric knelt beside her, his instincts screaming at him to leave. This wasn't his fight. The Serani weren't part of his mission, and he wasn't in the business of rescuing anyone. But something held him there, a flicker of recognition, maybe even guilt, from a lifetime of running from those he couldn't save. Who did this to you? His voice came out rougher than intended, her lips trembled, but she spoke, barely a whisper. The Valek Syndicate. They left me to die. Eric's heart sank. The Valek Syndicate. He had crossed paths with them before, merciless slavers, arms dealers, the kind of people you didn't tangle with unless you had a death wish. And yet here she was, a victim of their cruelty, discarded like trash. He glanced over his shoulder. The creatures of Zorth 9 hunted at night. If they stayed here much longer, they'd both be dead. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, leave her, or take her with him and risk everything. Can you walk? He asked, pulling her to her feet. She winced but nodded, leaning heavily against him. As they moved away from the crevice, Eric's mind raced. He hadn't signed up for this. Yet, something about the way her weak voice had whispered that name. The Valek Syndicate made him reconsider. There was more to this girl than he could see, and he was about to find out just how deep the trouble ran. The dark skies of Zorth 9 thickened as the twin moons rose, casting a dim, eerie glow over the desolate landscape. Eric and the girl, Lasara, moved quietly through the rocky outcrops, each step a painful reminder of how dangerous this planet was. The faint growls and distant shrieks of the predators echoed from all sides, as though the very air was alive with menace. Lasara stumbled, her fragile frame barely able to keep pace. Eric caught her just in time, his gloved hand gripping her arm firmly. She flinched but said nothing, her breath shallow and strained. We need to keep moving, Eric muttered, scanning the horizon. The creatures, they hunt by scent. Lasara nodded weakly but her eyes were distant, as if the weight of something far more dangerous than the creatures bore down on her. The Valek Syndicate. That name lingered in Eric's mind like a curse. He had a history with them, a history he had no intention of revisiting. They found a temporary refuge in a hollowed-out cavern beneath the cliffs. Eric lit a small flare, just enough to cast a dim light in the confined space. Lasara sank to the ground, clutching her side. Blood, dark and shimmering like liquid silver, stained her robe. I can't stay here, she whispered, her voice trembling. They'll come for me. They always do. Eric knelt beside her, eyes narrowing. The Syndicate? What do they want with you? Lasara hesitated, then met his gaze. Her eyes, a strange swirling mix of violet and silver, seemed to reflect a deeper knowledge than her frail form suggested. It's not just me. It's my people. We were peaceful scholars. We knew things about the universe. Things the Syndicate fears. Her voice trembled but grew stronger as she spoke. They see us as a threat because we understand the old technology. We can expose them, ruin everything they've built. Eric's jaw clenched. He had heard rumors of the Serani's knowledge, how they had secrets of the ancient races, hidden technologies lost to time. The kind of knowledge that made powerful men and syndicates tremble. And they left you here to die? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Lasara nodded. I was the last. They wiped out my entire colony, my family. I was just a child when they took me. When they found out I knew too much, they decided I was too dangerous to live. Eric leaned back, his mind racing. He didn't need this. He was a mercenary, not a hero. But the thought of leaving her behind to die, just like so many before her, gnawed at him. A sudden, guttural roar tore through the air outside, sending a chill down Eric's spine. The creatures were getting closer. They'll smell us soon, Eric muttered, standing up. He grabbed Lasara by the arm, pulling her to her feet again. If we're going to survive the night, we need to move. Now, her eyes held a quiet desperation, but also a flicker of trust. Eric hated that. He wasn't here to be anyone's savior. Yet as they slipped back into the darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that walking away from this girl might just doom them all. The night clung to Zorth 9 like a shroud. Eric could feel the weight of it pressing down, the thick atmosphere of the planet making every breath feel like a labor. His pulse quickened as he and Lasara crept through the rocky terrain, every shadow a potential death sentence. The monstrous creatures prowled, unseen but ever present, their low growls reverberating through the air like a constant reminder of how close death lingered. But there was something worse than the creatures hunting them now. They're here, Lasara whispered, her voice barely audible. But enough to send a chill through Eric. He didn't need to ask who. The Valek Syndicate had found them. Eric's heart sank as he scanned the landscape, the distant glow of lights moving in the darkness. Syndicate ships. Fast. Efficient. Deadly. How many? Eric asked, his voice low, his hand instinctively tightening around the hilt of his blaster. 2 ships. More will come once they realize I'm still alive, she replied, her violet eyes reflecting both fear and a strange calm, as though she had expected this moment all along. Eric cursed under his breath. The Syndicate wasn't just here for a routine sweep, they were coming for her with precision and purpose. They didn't leave loose ends. And now Eric was caught in the crossfire. We have to move, he said, his mind racing through escape routes. If we stay out in the open, they'll have us pinned in minutes. Without another word, Eric led Lasara into the narrow crevices between the jagged rocks, their steps swift but careful. Every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence of the night, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots, the distant hum of the Syndicate's ships hovering closer. A sudden flash lit up the sky, followed by the unmistakable whine of energy weapons discharging. They were already being fired on. Eric pushed Lasara forward, his instincts from years of combat kicking in. Go. Keep moving. The ground exploded behind them as a blast struck the rocks, sending fragments scattering through the air. Eric rolled, pulling Lasara down with him, narrowly avoiding the shards of debris that flew past. Another ship swooped low, its searchlight scanning the surface with cold, clinical precision. They're going to pin us down, Eric growled. We need cover, Lasara pointed ahead. There's a ravine, just past those rocks. With no other options, they sprinted toward the ravine. Ducking and weaving as more blasts tore into the ground around them. Eric's mind raced. He was trained for this, survival, evasion, combat, but the odds were stacking higher by the second. The Syndicate was relentless. They reached the edge of the ravine, barely making it before another energy blast struck the ground where they had just stood. Eric pulled Lasara down into the ravine, his breath heavy, adrenaline coursing through him. We can't keep running, Lasara whispered, her voice trembling. I know, Eric replied, his mind calculating their next move. We're going to have to fight, Lasara's gaze met his. They won't stop until I'm dead, or they get what they want. Eric checked the charge on his blaster. Grim determination settling in. Then let's make sure they don't get either. In the distance, the Syndicate's ships circled like vultures, closing in. The hunt had only just begun. The entrance to the ancient ruins loomed ahead like the yawning mouth of a giant beast, hidden beneath the craggy cliffs. Faint markings, worn by centuries of decay, glowed faintly on the stone. It was a place that time had forgotten, but Lysara's gaze sharpened the moment she saw it. Eric followed her eyes. "You've seen this before?" Lysara nodded, her breathing still labored from their desperate flight through the ravine. "My people used to speak of these ruins, before the Syndicate wiped out everything. They said these places held power, old knowledge, older than anyone can remember." Eric's gut tightened. He had a bad feeling about old knowledge. He had seen what ancient technology could do, what horrors could be unleashed when it was misunderstood. Still, it was better than waiting for the Syndicate to catch up with them in the open. Without another word, he led the way inside. The air in the ruins was thick and musty, each step echoing down long-forgotten corridors. The walls hummed faintly with energy, though the source remained invisible. Eric's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, his blaster at the ready. But Lysara seemed different. She was no longer just a frightened girl. Her steps were more sure, her gaze more focused. "There are secrets here," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Things even the Syndicate can't touch." "Let's hope it's enough to get us out of this," Eric muttered, scanning the corridor behind them. The faint hum of Syndicate drones could be heard in the distance. They weren't far. They rounded a corner and found themselves in a large chamber, its ceiling lost to the shadows above. In the center stood a monolithic structure, an ancient machine, long dormant. Covered in alien glyphs that shimmered in Lysara's presence, Eric whistled softly. "What is that?" Lysara stepped forward, her fingers brushing the surface of the machine. "A beacon," she said softly. "An emergency signal. If I can activate it, it might send out a call for help, or a warning, or it'll bring the Syndicate down on us faster," Eric added, keeping his voice low. "You sure this is a good idea?" Lysara didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the glyphs, her hand tracing patterns as if she had known them her whole life. "This place was built by my ancestors," she whispered. "They knew the Syndicate would come one day. This was their failsafe." A low rumble shook the chamber. The distant sound of Syndicate ships was growing louder, more insistent. Time was running out. Eric clenched his jaw. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they're right on top of us. If you're going to do something, do it now." Lysara pressed her hand to the center of the beacon, and the machine roared to life with a deafening hum. Energy pulsed through the ruins, lighting up the ancient glyphs on the walls, casting long, flickering shadows around them. Eric's blaster was raised, scanning for movement, ready for the worst. Lysara's face was illuminated by the glow of the machine, her expression unreadable. "This will send a message to the old allies of my people. If they're still out there, and if they're not?" Eric asked, his grip tightening on his weapon. She looked at him, her voice steady. "Then we die here, and no one will ever know." The ground trembled beneath their feet. The Syndicate was close now, the whine of their weapons cutting through the air like a blade. Eric felt the walls closing in. "Whatever happens," he said, moving to Lysara's side, "we make them fight for it." In the distance, the sound of Syndicate boots hitting the ground echoed through the ruins, their arrival inevitable. The final stand had begun. The Syndicate soldiers moved with brutal efficiency. Their boots pounded against the ancient stone floor, the cold gleam of their helmets reflecting the flickering light of the activated beacon. Eric could hear them now, too close for comfort, their voices distorted through their comms, barking orders as they closed in. "We're out of time," he muttered, scanning the chamber for anything that could help. But it was just stone, shadows, and the ancient machine that was now humming with a growing, ominous energy. Lysara stood beside the beacon, her face pale but determined. "It's almost ready," she said, her fingers tracing the glowing glyphs. Her voice held no fear, but Eric could see the strain in her eyes. the weight of centuries of knowledge and expectation on her fragile shoulders. Eric checked the charge on his blaster, his mouth set in a grim line. I hope you're right. Because once they break through, we're going to be knee-deep in Syndicate scum. As if on cue, the first shots rang out, searing blasts that ricocheted off the stone walls, sending sparks flying. Eric ducked, rolling into position behind a crumbled pillar, his blaster already aimed at the advancing figures. The Syndicate soldiers moved like shadows. Quick and deadly, but Eric had fought worse. He fired, the energy blast striking one soldier cleanly in the chest, dropping him instantly. Another shot came his way, but Eric rolled to the side, returning fire with precision. 2 more soldiers fell, but for every one he took down, more appeared, swarming into the chamber like a tidal wave. They're too many. Eric shouted over the chaos. We can't hold them off forever. Lasara didn't respond, her focus entirely on the beacon. The machine was glowing brighter now, casting strange patterns of light across the chamber, but it wasn't fast enough. Eric could feel the tension mounting, the creeping inevitability of their failure. A flash of movement caught his eye. One of the soldiers had broken through the defense and was closing in on Lasara. Eric swore under his breath, firing a shot that barely grazed the attacker's arm. The soldier lunged forward, his weapon raised to strike Lasara down. Time seemed to slow. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed himself off the ground, throwing himself toward the soldier. With a grunt, he tackled the man, slamming him into the ground. They struggled, the Syndicate soldier stronger than Eric expected, but he managed to pull his knife and drive it into the gap in the soldier's armor. The man went limp, but Eric barely had time to catch his breath before more shots rang out. Lasara's voice cut through the chaos. It's ready, the beacon roared to life, its hum turning into a deafening pulse that sent waves of energy rippling through the chamber. The light from the machine intensified, growing so bright that Eric had to shield his eyes. The Syndicate soldiers hesitated, their formation breaking as they staggered backward, disoriented by the sudden surge of power. What's happening? Eric shouted over the noise, his voice barely audible against the roar of the beacon. Lasara looked up at him, her eyes glowing with the same light as the machine. The message, it's been sent. A tremor shook the ground, and Eric felt the energy in the air shift. Something was coming, something ancient, something powerful, but would it arrive in time? As the Syndicate regrouped for their final push, Eric knew they were down to their last few moments. The walls of the chamber shook, and he braced himself for what would come next. The final battle was about to begin. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the air itself seemed to hum with a strange, electric energy. Eric gritted his teeth, his blaster raised as the remaining Syndicate soldiers regrouped, their weapons trained on him and Lasara. But something had shifted. The pulse of the beacon echoed through the ancient stone chamber, louder now, more insistent. It was as if the ruins themselves were waking up. Get ready, Eric growled, his eyes darting between the advancing soldiers and Lasara. She was still standing by the beacon, her face illuminated by its blinding light, her hands resting on the glyphs that pulsed in rhythm with the energy in the air. Something's coming, Lasara whispered, her voice filled with an eerie calm. The beacon, it's calling them. Them? Eric shot a glance at her, his mind racing. Who exactly is it calling? Before she could answer, the Syndicate leader barked an order, and a hail of blaster fire erupted from the soldiers. Eric dove behind a fallen stone column, returning fire with deadly precision. He managed to take down 2 more soldiers, but they were closing in fast. And he knew they couldn't hold them off much longer. We need more than just a signal. Eric shouted over the chaos. We're outnumbered. Lasara didn't move from the beacon. Her eyes were locked on the ancient machine, and her voice was steady. They're here. At first, Eric didn't understand what she meant. But then he heard it, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep beneath the ruins. The walls vibrated, the ceiling cracked, and the very air became thick with an ancient power. The Syndicate soldiers hesitated, confusion flashing across their faces as the ground shook again, more violently this time. Suddenly, beams of light shot from the beacon, spreading across the walls and floor like veins of glowing energy. The ancient glyphs that covered the ruins flared to life, lighting up the chamber with a brilliance that forced everyone to shield their eyes. Eric stumbled backward, squinting against the light as something massive began to emerge from the depths of the ruins. Out of the cracks in the stone, massive figures appeared, giant constructs of shimmering, otherworldly energy. They towered above the soldiers, their forms shifting and fluid, yet solid enough to be terrifying. The Syndicate soldiers froze, weapons dropping in disbelief as the constructs moved toward them with slow, deliberate grace. One of the soldiers screamed, firing wildly at the nearest construct, but the shots passed harmlessly through its ethereal form. In an instant, the glowing figure extended an arm, and the soldier was lifted into the air, suspended for a moment before being flung against the wall with a bone-crushing thud. The others tried to retreat, but the constructs were relentless. Sweeping through the chamber with terrifying efficiency, disarming and dismantling the Syndicate forces with ease, Eric watched in stunned silence, his blaster lowered. What are they? Lysara turned to him, her eyes still glowing with the light of the beacon. The guardians of my people. They've been waiting for this moment, for a call to awaken. She looked at the constructs with a mixture of awe and sorrow. They will protect us, but they were never meant for peace. Within minutes, the battle was over. The last of the Syndicate soldiers lay broken on the floor, their weapons scattered across the chamber. The constructs hovered silently, their task complete, before slowly retreating back into the stone. Disappearing as quickly as they had come, Eric let out a long breath, lowering his blaster. That was something. Lysara nodded, her gaze lingering on the now dormant beacon. The message has been sent. My people's allies will come. Eric walked toward her, shaking his head in disbelief. You really think there's anyone left out there who cares? She met his gaze, her voice soft but firm. We'll find out. As they stood in the glowing remnants of the ancient ruins, Eric knew their journey wasn't over. But for the first time, they had a fighting chance.